The year is 1887, and the relentless sun of a Wild West summer scorches the small, dusty village where Caleb "Cobra" McRay lives in seclusion. Far from the life of violence that made him a legend, he has traded the dust of the roads and the smell of gunpowder for the quiet of a simple, solitary life. A man of few words, Caleb carries a wound in his heart that time cannot heal. The brutal murder of his wife and daughter. The tragedy has shaped his icy gaze and demeanor, transforming the legendary gunslinger into a ghost of his own past. His peace was not a genuine peace, but a fragile truce with the memories that haunted him. Every morning, as he watched the sun rise over the arid hills, he relived the horror of that night. Each sunbeam was a reminder of the fire that consumed his home and the lives he couldn't save. Caleb is tormented by guilt, a guilt that has trapped him in a limbo of pain and regret. His life, although tranquil on the surface, was a silent hell. The legend of Caleb "Cobra" McRay still echoed in saloons and around campfires. Rumors of his superhuman speed and infallible aim still terrified outlaws and inspired young men. But for Caleb, this fame was a burden, a distant echo of a man he was trying to forget. He buried his pistols, vengeance and justice, along with the part of himself he most despised, vowing never to stain his hands with blood again. His only mission was to survive, even if the act of living was an unbearable burden. But fate is a cruel player. His apparent peace was about to be shattered by news that would spread like fire in the wind. The butcher of his family, the man he swore to find and kill, has escaped from prison. The ghost of the past was no longer a memory, but a very real threat. And Caleb, the man who refused to be the Cobra, would be forced to unearth not only his pistols, but the darkest part of his soul. The question that hangs in the air is, will the desire for revenge consume him completely, or will he discover a new reason to fight, something beyond hatred? News of James, the butcher, Crowley's escape reached the village like a cold whisper, traveling from mouth to mouth until it found Caleb's ears. The name, once a silent nightmare, now resonated as a real and imminent threat. The fragile peace Caleb had built around his pain crumbled in an instant. The man who massacred his family and stole his peace was free, and vengeance, a dormant monster in the depths of his soul, awoke with a hungry roar. Rage and fury mixed with the guilt he carried. The inability to protect his family on that fateful day haunted him, and Crowley's escape felt like a punishment from fate. However, the feeling of powerlessness gave way to a glacial determination. Caleb, who had tried to hide from his past, would now confront it head-on. He unearthed his two pistols, vengeance and justice, carefully buried in the floor of his cabin. The cold metal in his hands was a heavy reminder of the man he was and what he needed to become again. Caleb's decision was not impulsive. It was a calculated and deliberate choice, made with the same coldness that made him a legend. He knew the confrontation was inevitable. Crowley, aware of Caleb's fame, would not rest until he eliminated him, fearing the vengeance that would come. The gunslinger, however, would not wait to be hunted. The hunt had been inverted. He prepared for the journey, sharpening his skills and his mind. He would be the predator, tracking the butcher in a deadly game of cat and mouse. Caleb's journey was no longer about a man running from his demons, but about a man seeking redemption through justice. But the line between vengeance and justice is thin. The question that hangs in the air is, will the thirst for blood blind him to the opportunity for true justice, or will he find a way to honor his family's memory without losing himself in the darkness? Caleb McRay's journey was not a direct path, but a labyrinth of strategies and traps. He knew that heading straight for Crowley's hideout would be a death wish. Crowley was a dangerous man, but predictable in his brutality. Caleb, with years, of experience in tracking and hiding, used his knowledge of the arid lands and escape routes to anticipate the gang's movements. The hunt transformed into a deadly game of chess, where the legendary gunslinger, instead of hiding, provoked and lured his enemies into unfavorable terrain, turning each confrontation into a meticulously planned ambush. He left a trail of violence and destruction, but not indiscriminately. Every outlaw who crossed his path was disarmed, humiliated and marked, sent back to Crowley's gang with a clear warning: the Cobra was back. This tactic not only weakened Crowley's group, but also sowed the seeds of discord and fear among them. With each confrontation, Caleb studied the gang's methods, learning about their supply routes and their weak points. The hunter became the bait, and the hunted, in their arrogance, believed they were in control. The inversion of the hunter and hunted roles was Caleb's trump card. He moved quickly and cunningly, using the terrain to his advantage to throw off trackers and avoid direct confrontations, except when they were on his own terms. He struck when and where he was least expected, using the Cobra legend as a psychological weapon. With each step, Caleb felt more connected to his past self, the one he had vowed to bury. The dust and blood felt like an old friendship, and vengeance, a forgotten old melody. However, this risky strategy was not without its dangers. Caleb's trail became notorious, and other bounty hunters and even rival outlaws began to follow him. Caleb's journey of vengeance was attracting more than just the enemies of his past. It was attracting the violence of the entire Wild West. The question is, will he be able to maintain his focus on the real prey, or will he be swallowed by the chaos he himself created? Caleb's quest for Crowley led him to a small, crumbling village, a place marked by grief and fear from the gang's violent actions. The community was mourning its dead, and the hope of justice seemed like a distant dream. It was here that Caleb crossed paths with Sarah, a young widow with eyes full of pain and an iron determination. Her husband, an honest man, was killed by Crowley in a senseless act of cruelty. Sarah didn't seek revenge, but justice. And more than that, she sought a way to end the cycle of violence that had destroyed her life. Initially, Caleb saw her as an obstacle. He was a lone wolf, used to forging his own path of fury and vengeance. Sarah, however, was the moral compass he had lost long ago. She wasn't intimidated by his fame or his icy gaze. On the contrary, she confronted the violence of his actions, reminding him of the weight his choices had on the innocent lives he inadvertently affected. Their alliance began out of necessity, but it evolved into something deeper. Caleb, used to being feared, began to see himself through Sarah's eyes, a man who, despite everything, still had a chance at redemption. Sarah was the force that kept him from getting lost in the darkness. She made him question the very foundations of his journey. Revenge was what he sought, but was that what his family wanted for him? With every step, she challenged him to think about the consequences of his actions, not just for himself, but for the world around him. The partnership transformed them. She, who sought justice, discovered that sometimes action is necessary. He who sought blood learned that true strength is not in killing, but in protecting and forgiving. Sarah's presence began to awaken a spark of humanity in Caleb, a warmth he thought had died with his family. He was no longer fighting just for revenge, but to ensure that other people wouldn't suffer the same fate. The journey, which began as a path of hatred, was turning into a path of responsibility and hope. The question now is not whether he will find Crowley, but whether he will have the courage to break the cycle of violence and make the right choice at the decisive moment. Crowley and his gang's trail led Caleb and Sarah to a place that seemed straight out of a nightmare, an old ghost town. The location, with its ruined buildings and dust-covered streets, was the perfect hideout for the butcher and his men. labyrinth of shadows and alleys that served as an ideal refuge for evil. The silence of the place was terrifying, a prelude to the storm of violence that was about to explode. The tension between the two mingled with the oppressive atmosphere, and the imminence of the final confrontation was palpable. Caleb, with his years of combat experience, mentally mapped out the location, identifying the best spots for ambushes and possible escape routes. He knew the confrontation would be brutal and that Crowley's gang would have the numerical and tactical advantage, as they were on their own turf. But Caleb had something they didn't: the legendary speed of the Cobra and the revenge plan he had cultivated for years. Sarah, in turn, used her knowledge of the terrain to identify cover points and escape routes, turning Caleb's revenge mission into a tactical war operation. The night before the confrontation was consumed by a tense stillness. Caleb, sitting in front of a fire, stared into the flames, reliving the night his life changed forever. Sarah's presence, however, was an anchor for his humanity, a reminder that his fight was for something more than just hatred. She didn't pressure him, but her silent presence encouraged him to reflect on the consequences of his actions. Vengeance, which was once a necessity, was now a burden, and forgiveness, a distant and frightening possibility. The dawn that followed was an omen, with the sun rising between the mountains, coloring the sky with shades of red and orange. The duel between good and evil, between vengeance and justice, was about to begin. Caleb, with his pistols in hand, looked at the ghost town, knowing that at the end of the day only one side would emerge victorious. The question that loomed was whether Caleb would emerge as the Cobra, or as the man he was trying to become, Caleb McRay. The dawn's silence was shattered by the dry sound of gunshots. The ghost town turned into a battlefield, a deadly dance between light and shadow, gunpowder and dust. Caleb, with the speed of the Cobra, moved like a ghost, using the ruins for uncover, taking down Crowley's outlaws one by one. Each shot was precise, lethal, a reminder of why his fame preceded him. But with every man he brought down, the weight of his actions grew, and he heard the echo of the screams from that night, mixed with the sounds of the gunfight. Sarah, in turn, was not just an observer. She used her intelligence and knowledge of the location to stay out of danger, but also to help Caleb, acting as a kind of eye in the sky. She warned him about hidden enemies and the traps Crowley's gang had set. Their alliance, forged in grief, proved to be an unstoppable force, combining Caleb's fury and skills with Sarah's cleverness and resilience. The tactical plan they had outlined the night before was working perfectly, weakening Crowley's gang and forcing them into a direct confrontation. The climax came in the main saloon, where the final confrontation was destined to happen. Caleb, with minor injuries, and Crowley, with a face marked by fury, faced off in a duel. The tension was almost unbearable. The two men, consumed by their pasts, looked into each other's eyes, a mirror of hatred and pain. Crowley, with a voice full of scorn, laughed at Caleb, mocking his journey of vengeance. The duel was fast and brutal. Bullets tore through the air, dust rising with each shot. Caleb's legendary reflexes were put to the test against Crowley's savagery. And then, at the height of the confrontation, Crowley's gun pointed directly at Caleb's chest. The moment froze. The sound of gunshots stopped. Caleb's life hung by a thread, and the fate of his journey was about to be decided by a single bullet. At the height of the confrontation, Caleb's gaze was not focused on the barrel of Crowley's gun, but on the man's face. He saw the hatred, the madness, and the darkness that Crowley represented. The bullet never came. With a speed that defied logic, Caleb dodged Crowley's strike and, in a fluid motion, disarmed him, tossing the butcher's gun away. The moment of triumph was his. Vengeance was a step away. Vengeance, his pistol, was cold in his hand, ready to be used to end the one who took everything from him. But the image of his wife and daughter was not in his mind. Instead, he remembered Sarah's words, the pain he saw in the eyes of the villagers, and the new reason to fight that he had discovered. The thirst for blood that had driven him to that moment gave way to an empty feeling. He could feel the weight of his own soul, which, in a moment of pure fury, he had almost thrown away. He raised the gun, but didn't shoot. He chose justice over vengeance. Crowley, confused and disarmed, just laughed. "Go on, shoot. Don't you have the guts?" he sneered. Caleb's response came in a heavy silence. He tied Crowley up and handed him over to the few lawmen who had arrived at the ghost town. The choice was cruel for the villain. Instead of the quick death he expected, his punishment would be to be confronted with the justice for his crimes. The worst revenge for a man like him, Caleb knew, was to have to live and be forced to face the consequences of his actions. With Crowley's fate sealed, Caleb felt an overwhelming sense of relief. The journey of hatred had come to an end, but not in the way he had expected. The peace he sought at the beginning of his seclusion was now genuine. He was finally free. He had kept his promise to his family, not with his enemy's death, but by delivering him to justice. For Caleb, vengeance was a redemption. With the butcher handed over to justice, Caleb felt a deep void. His entire life had been defined by violence, and in recent days, by the pursuit of vengeance. Now, with the mission accomplished, he was at a crossroads. He was no longer the legendary Cobra, a ghost haunted by the past. He was simply Caleb McRay, a man who, through a bloody journey, had found redemption. The peace he thought he had lost forever was no longer in seclusion, but in the possibility of a new beginning. Instead of returning to his solitary life, Caleb made a choice that surprised him as much as it surprised Sarah. He decided to stay and help rebuild the village that Crowley had devastated. Away from his pistols, he used his experience to train the residents to defend themselves, to build their own homes, and to cultivate the land. The legendary dexterity of the gunslinger was replaced by the patience of a mentor, teaching them not just to survive, but to prosper. The peace he sought was not an absence of conflict, but the construction of something new on the ruins of the old. Caleb's story spread, but the narrative had changed. The legends about the Cobra were replaced by stories of a man who, instead of drowning in vengeance, overcame it and chose justice. He was no longer a killer, but a protector. His journey, which began in hatred, ended in hope. Caleb and Sarah, now together, not as lovers but as companions, built a new life based on mutual respect and the memory of their losses. The gunslinger's legacy was not that of a bounty hunter, but of a man who learned to forgive himself. His final legend was not written in bullets, but in the seeds he helped to plant, in the walls he helped to build, and in the smiles he helped to restore. In the end, the deadly journey of a gunslinger in the Wild West became the story of a man who found peace, not through death but through life.